So when a country that historically ignores United Nations reprimands suddenly runs to the UN Security Council for help, uh, something completely unprecedented has happened.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's usually the sign of a massive geopolitical miscalculation or, well, a fundamental shift in the rules of engagement for an entire region.
Right. Which brings us to April 13th, 2024. Because after decades of fighting in the shadows, using proxies and covert operations, Iran and Israel engaged in open, direct conflict.
Yeah, the shadow war was officially over at that point.
Exactly. Following an Israeli strike on the Iranian consulate in Damascus, a strike that killed 7 members of Iran's Revolutionary Guards, Iran retaliated. And we are talking about a massive barrage here.
It was unprecedented.
Over 300 drones and ballistic missiles crossed the night sky, targeting Israeli military facilities.
Right. It was a direct barrage that just shattered a long-standing status quo in the Middle East.
Yeah.
It was the exact moment the shadow war stepped into the blinding light of day.
Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to today's deep dive. Our mission today is to figure out a very specific puzzle, which is how exactly did Iran become this feared, fiercely independent military juggernaut?
It's a great question because it's not a simple answer.
No, not at all. We're looking at a nation that constantly defies Western superpowers, builds its own massive weapons programs while under, crippling sanctions, and essentially operates entirely on its own terms.
Well, to understand that level of modern defiance, you absolutely cannot just look at the 20th century.
Right.
Like, looking only at the 1979 revolution is like looking at the tip of an iceberg to understand a glacier,
Yeah, you're missing the mass underneath.
Exactly. The real mass, the geopolitical gravity driving their decisions today, was frozen in place thousands of years ago. You really have to look at their millennia-long memory of being a global superpower.
Okay, so I was looking through the timeline, and human history in that specific region goes back roughly 100,000 years to Neanderthal artifacts.
It's wild to think about.
It is. The German philosopher Hegel actually called Iran the first historical nation in the world.
And he's not wrong. It truly is a cradle of civilization. I mean, long before the Persians, you had the Susa tribes and the Elamites.
Okay.
Then the Medes formed the first true Iranian empire to defeat the Assyrians in the 7th century BC.
Wait, really? Because I always thought the baseline for their history was Cyrus the Great and the Persians.
Well, it's an evolution, right? The Medes set the stage, but you are right that the true foundation of their national identity solidifies with the Achaemenid Empire under Cyrus the Great and Darius the First.
Got it.
And the sheer scale of their ambition was just staggering. Under Darius, they controlled territory stretching across 3 continents.
Wow.
Yeah, Europe, Asia, and Africa. They even built an early precursor to the Suez Canal, connecting the Nile to the Red Sea.
See, but looking at how they operated, it's their administrative style that really caught my attention.
Oh, it was revolutionary for the time.
Yeah. It wasn't just brute oppressive force. They practiced a form of radical tolerance for the ancient world. They actually respected the religions and cultures of the people they conquered.
They did. They let people keep their gods and their customs.
Right. It's almost like they built a highly successful ancient version of the European Union, held together by cultural respect and administrative brilliance, rather than just, military occupation.
That administrative brilliance is key. I mean, they didn't want to just burn villages. They wanted a functioning, profitable, global society.
Makes sense.
And this identity as a peerless superpower, it went on for centuries. Later, under the Parthian and Sasanian dynasties, Persia spent 700 years going toe-to-toe with the Roman and Byzantine empires.
700 years.
Yeah. In fact, the Parthian heavily armored cavalry famously decimated Roman infantry lines on multiple occasions.
Okay, so I'm trying to put myself in their shoes here. If your collective cultural memory for 700 years is literally being the center of the civilized world, going toe-to-toe with Rome, how do you mentally recover when that empire eventually collapses?
Yeah.
It just seems like an impossible loss of ego.
Well, the short answer is you don't ever really recover from it.
Right.
When your foundational expectation of the world is sovereignty and dominance, you do not easily accept becoming a subordinate. That deep-seated pride is the bedrock of everything that comes next.
And the fall was incredibly abrupt, too. We moved from this ancient glory to a period of absolute cultural whiplash. The Sasanian Empire falls to Arab Muslim invaders in the 7th century, and they didn't even put up a massive, drawn-out fight.
Well, they couldn't. The exhaustion from those 700 years of continuous war with Rome had just left them hollowed out, both militarily and economically.
Wow. And the cultural split this caused is fascinating. Some Iranians embraced the arrival of Islam as a blessing and a spiritual truth. But others, they felt the Arab conquest as a humiliating foreign subjugation of their ancient Persian heritage.
It deeply fractured their identity, and unfortunately for the population, the Arab conquests were really just the beginning of centuries of unimaginable trauma.
Yeah, because then we get to the 13th century and the Mongol invasions. Genghis Khan.
Followed later by Timur. And the Mongol invasions didn't just conquer Iran, they fundamentally altered its geography and demographics.
They were brutal.
Beyond brutal. They wiped out massive populations, sometimes killing, like most of the men in a given city. But more importantly, they destroyed the ancient complex irrigation systems known as qanats.
Okay, let's explain what those are, because losing them seems to have changed everything.
Yeah, so qanats are essentially underground aqueducts. They tap into groundwater in mountainous areas and channel it to arid plains. They're marvels of ancient engineering that made agriculture possible in the desert, and the Mongols systematically destroyed them.
Jeez. So they just ruined the land.
Exactly. When you destroy the water supply, arable land turns back into desert. It forces mass starvation and completely alters where and how human beings can even survive in the region.
So by the 1500s, the region is broken, fractured, and traumatized by centuries of brutal foreign rule. But then we hit this massive pivot in the year 1501.
The Safavids.
Right, the Safavid Empire takes control, and they make a decision that changes the course of the Middle East forever.
Yep.
They established Twelver Shia Islam as the official state religion.
And this wasn't just, a sudden spiritual awakening for the ruling class.
No.
No, it was a highly calculated geopolitical strategy. At the time, Iran was surrounded by massive, powerful Sunni empires. You had the Ottomans to the west and the Mughals to the east.
Right.
By forcefully establishing Shia Islam, the Safavids purposefully separated themselves from their rivals.
Okay, so the Safavids effectively built a cultural fortress with Shia Islam.
That's the perfect way to look at it. They became a formidable gunpowder empire using modern weaponry and a distinct unifying religious identity to loudly declare that they were fundamentally different from the rest of the Islamic world.
And unify.
Yes, it was the birth of the modern Iranian national identity.
But, walls of religion don't matter much when the Industrial Revolution hits and suddenly European empires are knocking down your door looking for the one thing buried under your soil.
Oil.
Oil.
Yeah, the game changed entirely. By the late 19th and early 20th century, the British and Russian empires started heavily encroaching. They were seeking monopolies, and they manipulated the weak Qajar dynasty that was in power at the time.
So the country is sliding into chaos and poverty again. And then, in 1925, a brilliant, highly capable, but utterly ruthless military man named Reza Shah Pahlavi takes over.
He was a very polarizing figure.
Extremely. He decides Iran needs to modernize to survive the 20th century, and they need to do it overnight.
Yeah, he built railroads, secular schools, cinemas, bus networks.
But he forces this modernization through a brutal police state.
He really did. I mean, he mandated that mosques put in chairs, which goes against traditional Islamic prayer practices. He formally banned traditional hijabs for women, and he literally forced men to wear flat-brimmed Western hats.
Here's where it gets really interesting. It sounds like Reza Shah tried to forcibly install a totally new operating system on a computer while it was still running, and the whole machine just crashed.
That's a great analogy.
He physically and violently suppressed protests. There was a horrific massacre at the Imam Reza Shrine in 1935. And the protesters didn't just call him a dictator, they literally likened him to Yazid.
Which is massive.
Yeah. In Shia history, comparing a leader to the tyrant who slaughtered the prophet's grandson is basically the ultimate religious excommunication. It meant he wasn't just a bad leader, he was an enemy of God.
And the religious blowback was immense. But, the underlying issue wasn't just religious conservatism.
What was it then?
Well, during World War II, when Reza Shah refused to quickly expel German engineers, the Allied forces, so Britain and the Soviet Union, simply invaded Iran.
They just moved in.
Yep. They deposed him, and they installed his young son, Mohammad Reza, onto the throne.
Which brings up an important distinction I want to ask you about. Was the public anger primarily about the modernization itself, like the trains and the secular schools? Or was it the humiliating reality that their leaders were just middlemen for Western powers, because Mohammad Reza was widely viewed as a weak British puppet?
It was undeniably a combination of both, But the puppetry is the core wound.
Okay.
Imagine the psychological toll. The Iranian people, who view themselves as the heirs of an ancient, independent superpower, are watching their supposed king take direct orders from London and Washington.
Right. It's that loss of ego again.
Exactly. In 1953, when Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister Mossadegh tried to nationalize the oil industry, the CIA and British intelligence literally orchestrated a coup to overthrow him and consolidate the Shah's power.
So the modernization felt like a foreign imposition, just a superficial gloss over deep corruption and authoritarian oppression.
Yes.
Which brings the plot to an absolute boiling point. The resentment against this Western puppetry and forced secularization explodes in 1979 with the Islamic Revolution.
And the Shah is overthrown, fleeing into exile. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini returns from exile to a crowd of millions in Tehran.
They completely sever ties with the West and create a government structure that is entirely unique, an Islamic republic based on the concept of vilayat-e-faqih.
Which translates to the guardianship of the Islamic jurist.
Okay.
Khomeini championed the idea that society, to avoid the corruption and foreign influence of the past, needs the ultimate guidance of a religious scholar.
I want to break down how this actually works mechanically because it explains so much of their modern politics. It's essentially a dual-state system, isn't it?
It is. On one level, you have a somewhat standard republic. The people elect a president and a parliament to handle day-to-day governance, filling potholes, managing the budget, dealing with local issues.
Right.
But sitting above that entire system is the supreme leader, an unelected cleric who controls the military, the courts, and state media.
And there's a guardian council that literally gets to vet and disqualify candidates before they even run for president.
Yeah.
So the democracy is heavily filtered.
Precisely.
Sure.
The system is designed so that the religious clerics hold a permanent veto over the elected officials. It ensures the state can never accidentally drift away from its core Islamic anti-Western ideology.
And nothing cemented that anti-Western ideology more than the event that defines U.S.-Iran relations to this day, the hostage crisis.
Oh, absolutely.
In late 1979, the U.S. admitted the exiled Shah for cancer treatment. In response, Iranian students stormed the U.S. embassy in Tehran, labeling it a den of spies. They took 52 Americans hostage and held them for 444 days.
And to Khomeini, this is a massive popular victory.
Right.
He used the prolonged crisis to consolidate his own power internally and cement anti-American sentiment, famously labeling the U.S. the Great Satan.
But we have to note, the international community viewed it as a gross violation of fundamental diplomatic law. I mean, you do not take diplomats hostage, even in open conflict. This single event sparked decades of crippling international sanctions and total diplomatic isolation.
Right.
So help me understand the underlying calculation here.
Yeah.
They had to know this would isolate them economically. Why embrace such extreme consequences?
Because for the new regime, economic isolation was a feature, not a bug.
A feature.
Yes. This absolute rejection of the West was their extreme method of ensuring no foreign power could ever pull the strings of their government again.
Wow.
If you don't do business with the world can't threaten to bankrupt you to get what they want. Total economic isolation was considered an acceptable price to pay for uncompromising sovereignty.
But just as they lock the doors and pull up the drawbridge to establish this isolated republic, their neighbor kicks the door in. In 1980, Iraq's Saddam Hussein invades Iran's oil-rich Khuzestan province.
Saddam wanted to be the new strongman of the Middle East. He looked at Iran and saw a military decapitated by the recent revolution, a country in internal chaos, and he just completely misjudged their resolve.
He thought it would be easy.
He famously boasted he would reach the Iranian capital in 3 days.
Instead, we get an 8-year bloodbath. And this war is absolutely crucial for understanding modern Iran. Iraq is backed by nearly the entire globe. The U.S., the Soviets, France, the U.K., the Arab states, they are all funding Saddam.
Everyone was on his side.
Right. Iraq is even using chemical weapons, mustard gas, and nerve agents on the battlefield against Iranian troops.
While Iran, completely isolated and cut off from global military supply chains, is forced to resort to human wave tactics.
Which the mechanics of that are just horrifying.
Yep.
They were essentially sending thousands of young men, sometimes barely armed volunteers, directly into the line of fire to overwhelm Iraqi positions.
Yeah, simply by absorbing bullets until the enemy ran out of ammunition.
The psychological toll that takes on a society, losing up to 1 million people, basically sacrificing an entire generation, is unimaginable.
It scarred the nation. By 1982, Iran actually managed to push Iraq back to the border, but then Khomeini decided to try and export the revolution to Iraqi Shias, hoping to topple Saddam.
So we kept going.
Yeah, so the war dragged on for 6 more agonizing years, finally ending in 1988 with a UN ceasefire.
And immediately following that ceasefire, the trauma turns inward. The regime initiates a brutal purge, executing between 1,400 and 30,000 internal political prisoners.
They targeted anyone who could challenge the clerical rule. This included leftists, members of the Tudeh Communist Party, and they heavily targeted the MEK.
And just to clarify for everyone listening, the MKK, the People's Mujahideen of Iran, was an Iranian militant group that had actually helped overthrow the Shah initially, but then violently clashed with Khomeini's clerics over power.
Exactly. The regime used the end of the war to systematically liquidate their domestic opposition. And post-Khomeini, Ali Khamenei takes over as supreme leader, and you see a country trying to rebuild.
Right. You have pragmatic presidents like Rafsanjani trying to rebuild the shattered economy, and later reformists like Mohammad Khatami trying to open up society.
But those reformists constantly crash into the reality of Vilayat-e Faqih. The conservative clerics and the supreme leader block any meaningful change.
Constantly.
It led to massive student protests in 1999 and sparked the deep political apathy we see among Iranian youth today.
But taking a step back to that Iran-Iraq war,
Sure.
did surviving an 8-year conflict where literally the entire world funded their enemy and turned a blind eye to chemical weapons essentially teach Iran that international rules are a myth?
That is the defining insight of their modern era. The war forged their modern military doctrine. They learned that international law will not save them.
Yeah.
The UN will watch them be gassed and do nothing if it suits the superpowers. The lesson was crystal clear. Independence requires impenetrable, entirely self-reliant self-defense.
Which manifests directly into what Iran is today, a highly militarized, self-sufficient regional fortress. They currently rank 14th globally out of 145 countries in military strength.
It's a massive force.
They have over 500,000 active troops, heavily utilizing the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC.
But the real story is how a nation under some of the strictest financial and trade sanctions in human history manages to build an arsenal. Because they couldn't just buy modern fighter jets or defense systems from the West.
Right, so they built their own.
Yeah.
How exactly does a heavily sanctioned country pull off a massive domestic ballistic missile program?
Through an incredibly sophisticated network of illicit trade, front companies, and reverse engineering. They acquired dual-use technologies on the black market parts meant for civilian aviation or industry and repurpose them.
Oh, wow.
They capture downed American or Israeli drones, take them apart piece by piece, and figure out how to manufacture their own versions.
That's intense.
Today, they have cruise missiles and ballistic missiles with a 2,000-kilometer range. They've become so proficient that they are actually exporting these weapons, like selling suicide drones to Russia for the war in Ukraine.
But possessing the weapons is only half their strategy. Because of the sheer trauma of the 1980s, Iran's leaders decided they never, ever want to fight a direct, conventional war on their own soil again.
Never.
So they built what they call the Axis of Resistance.
Right, it's a massive, highly coordinated proxy network. Instead of deploying the official Iranian army, the IRGC funds, trains, and arms allied militant groups across the region.
Like who?
Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, and various militias in Iraq and Syria.
Which brings us to the Ring of Fire strategy. They basically surround their primary adversaries, specifically Israel and U.S. bases in the region, with heavily armed proxy groups. The logic is that if anyone decides to bomb Tehran, Iran doesn't even need to launch a missile from its own soil initially. They just activate the proxies, who can overwhelm Israel's Iron Dome from all sides. It keeps the chaos far away from Iranian borders.
It's a strategy of asymmetric deterrence. And speaking to their relationship with Israel, it is a fascinating historical pivot, because under the Shah, they were tacit allies.
Really?
Yeah. Iran was actually the second Muslim-majority country to recognize the State of Israel.
But under the Islamic Republic, that dynamic inverted completely. The new theological ideology views Israel as an illegal occupier, an outpost of Western imperialism in the Middle East.
Right.
They label Israel the little Satan alongside the U.S. as the great Satan. The ideology literally demands Israel's removal from the region.
Which brings the entire deep dive full circle back to April 2024. For decades, Israel and Iran fought a shadow war. Israel assassinating Iranian nuclear scientists, Iran funding Hezbollah attacks. But the Israeli strike on the Damascus consulate forced Iran's hand.
They felt they had to respond directly from their own soil, to maintain their deterrence.
Yes.
It's the culmination of all this history. If you look at the Medes fighting the Assyrians, the Safavids holding off the Sunni Ottomans, or today's ballistic missile strikes, um, Iran's entire geopolitical strategy is about projecting power outward.
To ensure they are never conquered, humiliated, or manipulated at home again.
Right.
It is a nation shaped equally by ancient imperial glory and modern horrific trauma. They view themselves as a fortress holding out against a hostile world.
It really is an incredible journey. From the tolerant multi-continental empire of Cyrus the Great, through the devastation of the Mongols destroying the Khanates, the humiliation of forced westernization under British puppet kings, to a modern, heavily sanctioned Islamic republic that reverse engineers its own drones just to survive on its own terms.
It changes entirely how you read the geopolitics of the region.
It really does. So to you listening, the next time you hear a news alert on your phone about tensions in the Middle East, you'll know you aren't just looking at a modern political spat. You are witnessing the actions of a nation driven by thousands of years of memory and raw survival instincts.
Very true.
But I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder. For nearly 50 years, Iran's entire national identity has been forged in the fire of resisting foreign intervention, of keeping the outside world at bay. But with a young population that is growing increasingly apathetic to the rigid clerical politics of the past, what happens to a fortress nation when the people inside the walls decide they want to write a completely different kind of history?